Good afternoon. My name is Alana Lindgren. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts, and it's my great pleasure on behalf of my colleagues to welcome you to the second in our Creative Futures series. I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples, on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Creative Futures is a new speaker series highlighting the achievements of the Faculty of Fine Arts scholars and artists whose research and creative activity addresses the defining issues of our time. This year's theme is sustainability and climate change. The arts, as many of you know, have a central role to play in encouraging people not only to care, to make emotional investments in scientific data related to climate change, but the arts can also inspire new modes of thinking that foster new conversations and alliances between communities' concerns with sustainability and the health of our planet. Here in the Faculty of Fine Arts, we have no shortage of faculty members who are doing fascinating work when it comes to sustainability, the environment, the climate crisis, and work related to sustainability in general. So we thought it was time to share the work that we're doing with the rest of the campus and the community at large. Today's conversation will be moderated by Professor Dennine Dudley. Dineen grew up surrounded by the evergreen forests and freshwater lakes of the Sinaiks, homeland in the BC interior. In her previous role as a Near Eastern archaeologist, her work and her travels often took her to desert regions and involved encounters with precarious ecosystems and the local traditions of human adaptation to their harsh conditions. A longtime instructor in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies here on the coastal rainforest, Dineen teaches environmental art, a course which she sees as embracing the intersections between geography, visual arts, and personal and cultural memory, and through which she works to facilitate her students multiple ways in which they can explore and position their own relationships to their environments. Thanks for moderating today's webinar, Dineen. Over to you.
Thank you, Alana. Welcome, everybody. Just to outline the structure of today's event, I will be individually introducing our fine arts speakers, Sean Holman, Colin Malloy, and Paul Walde, before we move into a discussion. There will be opportunity for you to ask questions at the end, and the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen will open a window in which you can type your questions at any time through the event. Right now, I'm going to start by introducing our speakers in alphabetical order, asking each one to spend a few minutes introducing his work addressing the climate crisis. Sean Holman is the Wayne Crookes Professor of Environmental and Climate Journalism in the Department of Writing. Before entering academia, Sean was an investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker, best known as the founder and publisher of the pioneering public affairs news service, Public Eye. A frequent commentator on climate change coverage and government secrecy, Sean's byline has appeared in leading papers across Canada, such as the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and the Vancouver Sun, as well as locally in the Times Colonist. In 2012, he received a special mention in the Canadian Newspaper of the Year competition for his use of new and emerging media technologies to expand the number of journalistic voices in this country and redefining the relationship between journalists and citizens. These new relationships are a feature of his current work, the Climate Disaster Project, which connects journalists and social workers at the faculty and student levels with climate crisis survivors, helping them to document their stories and share them with the wider public. Sean, can you take a few minutes to tell us more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so very much for that lovely introduction and also the invitation to talk a little bit more about the Climate Disaster Project. It's really based on the notion that we are all climate disaster survivors in one way, shape, or form or another. Whether you've experienced heat stroke, heat exhaustion, smoke inhalation, evacuation, or many of the other kinds of disaster effects we're seeing around the world, we are all climate disaster survivors. And yet we don't really think of ourselves that way. And we don't really think of ourselves that way because in a lot of ways, how we talk about climate change, how we cover climate change, and the activism related to climate change has really dehumanized that particular subject. It has talked about climate change in the future tense. It's talked about climate change as an environmental issue, as a political issue, as an economic issue. It's really failed to talk about how climate change is affecting each and every one of us. So what we're doing with the Climate Disaster Project, it's a network of 11 post-secondary institutions in Canada and now around the world. We work with climate disaster survivors to help them share their stories, the stories of their experiences with climate change. The purpose of this is so that we can feel less alone when it comes to our climate disaster experiences, and so that we can actually build community around that experience of climate change. Because if we can build community around that experience of climate change, then we can find hope in what we're all going to be facing together. So that's really the driving idea behind the Climate Disaster Project. And we're going to be seeing some of the outcomes of that over the next couple of months. Megaphone Magazine, which is a street newspaper in Vancouver, in fact, next month is going to be publishing their entire edition devoted to these kind of climate disaster firsthand accounts our students have helped assemble. And we're really looking forward to seeing the results of that.
Great, thank you. I look forward to diving more into that in the discussion. Okay. Colin Malloy is our next speaker. He is an interdisciplinary PhD candidate in the departments of music and computer science. His PhD research is centered on music technologies and the Caribbean steel drum, also known as the steel pan. Historically, steel pans were made from old barrels cast off from the oil industry. And in solo and collaborative efforts, one of the aspects of Colin's work is to examine this relationship. Besides performing in a number of ecologically themed works, Colin designs custom software for acoustic analysis and performance, and is a talented composer. In 2016, his piece Cascade, written for percussion ensemble and three-channel sound, percussion ensemble and three-channel soundscape, was a reflection on the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, an important federally protected area that spans Southern Oregon and Northern California. He is currently the artist in residence for Ocean Networks Canada, where his project is to create an electroacoustic musical work using the steel pan as a lens to examine the relationship between the ocean and the oil industry. Colin, I'd like you to share with the audience more about yourself and your work, please.
Oh, sure, thank you. So as you said, I'm a PhD student. I'm nearing completion, so hopefully I'll be doing my dissertation soon. But so my work spans the entire gamut. Is centered on the steel pan and music technology. As you say, I am a scientist. I do acoustics research and computational analysis of the steel pan. I make my software to then process that, and then I perform with it to make special fancy sounds using my steel pan. And so this summer, as you mentioned, I am the artist in residence for Ocean Networks Canada. And so I've been meeting with the researchers there, and I've been learning about how the state of our oceans, how various things are affecting the oceans, and how the oceans relate to climate change. Because as the initial theme of my piece it's in process, is going to be using the steel pan as a lens to, as you mentioned, to examine the relationship between the oil industry, which the steel pan is kind of historically tied to, and the oceans. And so I'm learning all about how things that I never knew existed, about not just what's going on in the air above the water, I guess my hand's up here, but what's going on with in terms of carbon emissions and other effects on the ocean, how it's changing the water temperatures, not just sea level rise as most people think about, but water temperatures, acidification of the oceans, and deoxygenization, it's a mouthful, things like that. And then I'm wrapping that up into hopefully a musical package that people can experience and have some thoughts on, and hopefully get something out of.
Great, thank you. That sounds most interesting. Right. Our third speaker today, Paul Walde, is an award-winning artist, composer, and curator, and has been a professor in the visual arts department since 2012. Paul's work has addressed relationships with nature since the creation of his first sound project, Northern Symphony, in 2001. In 2013, he completed Requiem for a Glacier with choir and orchestra live on the Farnham Glacier in the Purcell Range. Subsequently developed into a multi-channel sound and video installation, it has been exhibited across the nation and continues to inspire, being featured in Arts Help and Luna Film and Media Art Quarterly last fall, and in the February 2022 issue of Inter Alia magazine. Recent projects have included Of Weather for Jeff Hendricks, which was part of the 2018 Work of Wind, held on an active industrial site in Mississauga. And you may also have heard him recently on CBC Radio's On the Island, discussing the vital role of the creative arts in the fight against climate crisis. Paul, can I invite you to explore your work further with the audience, please?
Yeah, thanks, Dineen. I've been working with environmental themes, my work since about 1994. I was living in New York at the time and realized that my upbringing in Canada, in Ontario, I grew up in the Great Lakes area in Ojibwe territory, and realized that that was a different experience than some of my classmates had growing up in different parts of the world, and decided that maybe that was something that I should try to explore my work. And then eventually that led me to dealing with climate, which really started in the early 2000s. I went on a trip up to the Yukon and discovered that the permafrost was melting and that it was disrupting some of the infrastructure up there. And it just seemed really important to me that at the time, no one was really talking about this issue. And I wondered if there was a way for a role for the arts, and particularly in my own work, to deal with these issues and try to get the word out in some way. And that, of course, has led to the projects that you were mentioning, Requiem for a Glacier, Alaska Variations, and hopefully I'll have a moment to talk about some of those projects during the discussion. But yeah, right now I'm working on an opera that's dealing with the state of the old growth forests, and I'm working with a group called the Tree of Life, which is a research group that Randy Cook put together, and Randy's a hereditary chief in Monteguela territory, and it's a group of scientists and artists, and we're looking at ways in which science and the arts can talk to one another in a way to, I guess, make the climate crisis more accessible, and also talk about the relationship with forests as well. So there's a lot of information there to process as an artist, but for me, I'd rather deal with information than start with a blank canvas. So I find it really inspiring to work this way.
Terrific. Okay, thank you all for sharing your work. I hope that gives the audience kind of a idea of what you're looking at. So let's move now to the discussion part of the day. So I've got a few questions to start us off with, and let's start with the large overarching concern, which is, how do you envision the role of the arts in helping people understand and navigate the climate crisis and its impacts? And I think, Colin, can you lead us off here?
Sure. So for me, I think it's really important to get your message out to people who need to hear it, right? So a lot of people are already believers and have bought into the idea of climate change. But for me, like, I really want my music to go out to people who maybe are just either uninspired or a little skeptical. And so I do things like sonify data and present information through sometimes through the program notes, since I don't use vocal music, but things that can inculcate a response in the listener that makes them feel have an emotional reaction that wants them to actually do something. So I'm very action oriented as a person, and so I think that it's really important to small steps can really add up to a long journey. But if you're not taking those steps, we can all sit around and agree that climate change is an issue. But if we're not doing things about it and supporting the things that need support, and we're not convincing people that it is an issue, then we're not actually helping or making a change.
Sure. Yeah. Paul, did you want to follow up there?
Yeah, Dineen, maybe it's a good time for me to share a little bit of Requiem for a Glacier, which you mentioned earlier, which is a piece that combines activism and climate change data. And it features a libretto that included the BC government's press release for the announcement of the year-round approval, or the approval of the year-round resort community, which was going to be called the Glenbow Glacier Resort Development, which ended up not happening, in part because of the activism around this. Now, that I'm not saying that Requiem was the thing that stopped it, but I think we played a role in doing that. So I'd like to play a short clip from that if there's time. So, sure. So in this piece, this is performed by volunteers, some who are activists, environmental activists, students, volunteers, and everyone felt a need to go and do something. And so I wrote this piece in a way that was accessible enough of a score that amateurs could perform it and go out there and do something. And we felt like this was a way to expand the dialogue beyond traditional forms of protest, which, and in traditional forms of protest, you're telling people you're either for something or against something. And art kind of opened it up in a way to make it a little more ambiguous. And through the work, as it's presented here as a video installation, I'm trying to give people time. It's a 40-minute piece, so people can think about what they're seeing and what they're hearing and spend time with their own thoughts, I think in a different way than you can in traditional media or on social media. We're bombarded with information. And so this, in some ways, it has the same amount of information, but it's stretched out over time. And hopefully what happens is you as a listener, as your experiences, has time to reflect upon your own position within this, which I think in some ways can be a more profound way of being or thinking about this stuff. I'm trying to stop sharing, but I can't get my I can't get my mouse to show up, so I'm going to try to just exit here and see if that works. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right. Lovely. So, Sean, can you follow up for us? Right, journalism is often sort of seen as the voice that speaks, and maybe you want to, again, respond to these ideas. You're muted still. Okay.
Sorry about that. So I think one of the big challenges with our politics today and the politics of the post-war period has been our reliance on the evidence equals action framework. The idea that if only we provide information, that people will take action, either because they believe that's the right thing to do, they've made a rational decision about it, or because they feel something as a result of that information. And what we've come to know is that that's just not true. That's not the way change works. And the very fact that we keep on relying on this evidence equals action formula is proof of the fact that evidence equals action doesn't work, because we're denying the evidence that it doesn't work. So I think the arts really has an enormous power at this particular moment in time, because really the arts are fundamentally about creating community and connection around various different issues and around various different experiences. And what we know is that the most powerful social movements of our time, of our age, have really been about the sharing of community and connection to mobilize large numbers of people. And that's not the way the climate change movement currently works. It's still really founded in this idea of look at what's going to happen, look at the evidence, and then we should take action on that basis. So I think the role of the arts is really, really super important, because it allows us to break out of that evidence equals action framework and start creating connection and community on the basis of climate change, which is also what the Climate Disaster Project is trying to do. And then as a result of that community, create change, create action, because we'll have found common purpose together on the basis of our shared experience.
Yeah, I mean, and that leads into the next question that I had was, I see, with all of you, so much of the work that you do is about creating a new environment for people. And whether that's the one that they're in as they experience the work or the one that they take with them. And so thinking about immersive experience and the sense of community and shared experience that's created from that is something that you can all dive into a little bit more. So maybe I'll bounce back to Paul here first for this one, and then come back to you, Sean and Colin. Okay.
Well, yeah, I think, creating experiences is really important. And, I just want to echo what Sean's saying about, bringing people together around experiences, I think is really important. And yeah, evidence is not convincing anybody. And what we really need is to develop a new cultural way of being. And I think we're learning that through our discussions around decolonization, indigenization. There's a lot of talk around that in the university, but these conversations are happening outside of the institution. But I think that how these things are going to manifest themselves in cultural ways, I think is vitally important. Our culture, and if we think of our culture extending to our economic systems and everything else, is at odds with the environment. It's at odds with the evidence that's, climate change is, staring us in the face. And some news agencies have stopped calling it climate change. The Guardian calls it global heating, because that's what's going on. So, again, I'm going to say, like, what I'm trying to do with my work, maybe, and I feel like I'm getting better at it, but I think, you have to start somewhere, is to try to create different types of experiences that are outside of our everyday experience, to give people the opportunity to have time with their own thoughts, to think about these things, present information differently, and hopefully have a different kind of response, to start creating that cultural shift that really needs to happen.
Yeah, sure. Okay, Sean, did you want to follow up there?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, one of the key parts of the work that I'm engaged in right now is creating spaces where climate disaster survivors, and we are all climate disaster survivors, can share the memories of their experiences with climate change in a fulsome way. We've developed a trauma-informed process that allows the survivors that we work with to do that. But before that happens, the students who are taking part in this project, which is a virtual national class involving a number of other universities across Canada and next year around the world, the students actually talk to one another about their own climate experiences and develop stories on that basis. And we find that that's really, really powerful because for the first time in their lives, right, in a lot of circumstances, they've really been able to have that sharing, to have that community around the experience of climate change. And what we're looking to do next year is we're going to be constructing a climate disaster survivor memory vault in which all of these interviews, all of these stories will be deposited in, creating almost a living account of climate change in action. That's going to be another new space where people who have experienced climate change can see that they're not alone in this experience. Other people have experienced the same thing too. And again, help create community, right, around this thing that we are all living through together. We're at the threshold of disaster right now. And it's so important that we start building new and more resilient communities around this experience so we can survive it together, because the alternative, right, is devastatingly inequitable communities that are exclusionary, that keep people out, who are experiencing the worst of climate change. And that's in our future if we don't do something about it.
Okay, so Colin, like as somebody who performs, music, assuming to audiences, you've got a community there that you're creating that group experience for all at once. So can you sort of like bring that in as you're talking about this, perhaps?
Sure. So, right. So when you're performing music, everyone's having that collective experience. And what I've noticed in thinking about just participating in this is that a lot of the music I like to do and have done for many years is echoing sort of what Paul was saying. It's very expansive, can be both in size as well as time length. So my piece that you mentioned earlier, Cascade, set people up and it inverted the normal. It's meant to be performed outside, even though it has electronic amplification. It inverts the normal situation where the audience kind of gathers around the performer, or there's the performers and there's the audience, right? So in my piece, the performers are in the center and they form a ring and they play outwards, and there's the three channels of audio go in different directions. And so it encourages the audience to move around, because where you are situated, you're going to experience a different version of the piece than someone that's on the opposite side, because you're hearing different things. The three channels are different. The performers are on all sides, and it's meant to be this both an interactive experience, but also a communal experience. People can walk around and experience these different things together, and then they can discuss the differences. I'm also a big fan of the composer John Luther Adams, who is one of the things he's known for is really big epic pieces, such as the Become series that are based on Become Ocean, Become River, Become Desert, which are based on climate change to an extent, as well as I've organized several performances of his epic percussion work Inuksuit, which is scored for up 9 to 99 percussionists. It's meant to be performed outside, and you're spaced out as far as you possibly can while still in hearing range of each other. And so another way that this happens is it encourages the audience to wander around and hear what is going on, these hour-long pieces from all these different vantage points, and gives them a time and space to experience this and think, reflect on what they're experiencing and actually process it. A lot of music, radio music is in short 2 to 3 minute clips, and it's meant to just entertain and then be gone. But when you have these really long works, which is my work is tending towards these days, it gives you both a space to experience it and to process it. And then is very nice to then, after the performance, connect with the audience and discuss. And I'm always thrilled to hear how I usually get compliments, and so it's always nice to receive those. But if they didn't like it, they're allowed to do that as well.
Yeah. So thinking about bringing people along with you, I wanted to ask you each, in thinking about engaging your students and with your students, and how you facilitate for them this process of articulating their relationships with the environments. And if that's not directly teaching in the classroom, maybe it's other other people working in the field and so on. So Sean, do you want to start here?
Yeah, I sort of already touched on this a little bit, but let me elaborate a bit. So, as I mentioned before, our students start working with climate disaster survivors. They actually interview one another and write stories about one another about their own climate disaster experiences. And the reason that's also important, not just for them, but for their survivors that they're working with, is because oftentimes, and too often, the news media has sort of created a second wound when it comes to covering communities that have been affected by climate change, particularly marginalized communities. So by understanding what this process is going to look like for them, right? And by taking each other through this process, the students taking one another through this process, they can better ensure that they don't create that second wound, right? That they actually have an opportunity to create community, right, with this climate disaster survivor that they're working with, which is really a whole entire point of the project. And I think this kind of work is just so important for students. So many students are just really hungering, right, for something to do about a problem that seems too big, too difficult for them to attack. And I think universities can play such an important role, and particularly fine arts, right, play such an important role in helping provide students with something that they can do, right, to take action on this most important of all issues.
Paul, do you want to chip in there?
Yeah, my classes are a little bit different. It sounds like than Sean's, but we're definitely not at odds with each other. That's for sure. But in my classes, I'm more trying to help the students unlock their own voices. And when we're dealing with the environment, one of the things I've been doing is just getting them outside. Getting them thinking about the land, thinking about where they are, looking, just observing, and spending time there, and hopefully finding ways for them to deal with it. Now, a lot of students do end up dealing with climate issues in their work, but I don't tell them that that's the assignment of the day. It's really more open-ended than that, so that they have the opportunity to start figuring it out for themselves, what exactly they want to say and how they want to contribute as artists. So, and certainly I provide examples of other artists who are working in interesting ways with regards to climate specifically, but they don't have a climate assignment or something. That could be interesting, but yeah, I think for me it's really about trying to respect the students as individuals and help them find their own way. So
yeah, I think that's both possibilities, again, for finding that self-positioning for them. Yeah, Colin, did you want to add something there?
Sure. Kind of like Paul, when we're working in music, whether it's music performance or music technology, the two areas I work in, most of the time it doesn't directly relate to climate change, right? But when we choose a piece that has that sort of theme, we can connect with them that way. But most of the time, when we're working on the artistic aspects of performance, you're trying to get away from just, you know, making the notes happen and getting them to happen in a way that really engages with something coming from deeper inside, some emotional core in the performer, and to make a connection with an audience member, to visualize there being someone there, and to, you know, project the emotion or the thoughts that you feel in that music into the you know, hearts and minds of people in the audience. And so you know, that can take any subject whatsoever. But my interest in, for example, my interest in this grew out of just performing pieces that had this theme and being exposed to it. It wasn't ever an overt assignment, much like in Paul's classes, but you know, it kind of grew. There was a seed and grew steadily over time, and it's something I've done for a while, done other things, come back to, and revisited. And so I think that's really key for us, is to just be, you know, intellectually and emotionally prepared for these things, and to just have that exposure, so that for people who are inspired to go that route, they see that it is a possibility, as opposed to thinking that, you know, we need to just be playing non-programmatic music that is just there for its sonic beauty, which is also fine itself, but to see that that's an option.
Yeah, I mean, people need space to think about what they are going to say at some point. So yeah, good. Okay, how are we doing for time? All right, I think I'm going to go to my last question here, at least to start with. But thinking about the theme of the seminar in terms of documenting the climate crisis, if you could, you know, lean a little more heavily into this idea of documentation, because I think everyone is capturing something of this moment. So these aspects in how your work speaks to in and also of this time, and the importance of that record going forward as well. So I'll start with Paul here, if you could.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Dineen. I'm going to just take a moment, and I will share a little bit of a piece called Glennops from the Alaska variations. And what happened in that work, I was invited up to Alaska to do a series of works by the Anchorage Museum for part of their Polar Lab residency program. And they were really wanting artists to look at different aspects of climate change. And I decided to stick around Anchorage so I could work with the community and work with different musicians and artists that were around there. And I visited this park that's actually within Anchorage, and was looking at this mountain and at dusk and looking at the vegetation that was on this mountain. And one of the things I've learned through climate change research is that lower altitude vegetation is overtaking higher altitude vegetation. So as the planet warms, these higher altitude locations are becoming more able to accommodate lower level vegetation, and that vegetation is moving up the mountain and displacing these, you know, quite rare ecosystems. So what I did was, in terms of documentation, was document the specific location and then assign notes to each piece of vegetation that's on the mountain. And then there's a libretto, which is based on the Latin the Latin names of the plants that are on this mountain. So I'm just going to play a little bit of that and the example of documentation. I'll show you a photo first. Let's see if I can do this properly. We're going to share screen, and then I'm going to hit play, and hopefully everyone can see that. Oops, not yet. Sorry, got to hit the share button. There we go. And hopefully everyone can see that. And so this is the mountain, and this is a music staff that's been drawn across it. And that is the basis of this composition that I'm going to play hopefully next. And I'll just forward into a little bit of it. So what you see behind them is the mountain that the composition's based on, and they're performing in an abandoned church in Anchorage, actually in Spinard, a neighborhood in Anchorage. So I think there's a lot we can learn just by observing and documenting and looking at specific places and particular times and trying to unravel what those places are showing us, and then trying to find different ways to share that information with audiences in ways that hopefully will engage them in different ways than they might not normally maybe think about the environment and by extension climate change.
Great. Colin, could you follow up for us there?
Yes, sorry. Zoom opened something up for me. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so the way in which that I document things is quite varied, actually. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I do is data sonification, which means we're mostly familiar with data visualization, where you take data and you turn it into some sort of visual image that we can interpret. And so sonification is when you're taking data and somehow turning it into musical aspect somehow. And usually what we have to do is it works best by priming the audience so that they can they know what it's supposed to represent. It's like on a graph where you label your axes and what kind of data you're presenting. So that's one of my methods. I use a lot of nature sounds in my compositions, and so the ones that I'm working on with my project now with Ocean Networks Canada is they have vast hydrophone arrays. And a hydrophone is an underwater microphone, and they have amazing collection of, everyone would expect whale sounds, but they have one of the most amazing sounds I heard recently was a snowmobile going across ice, and with the Doppler effect as it is passing the hydrophone array and approaching and then passing, and then the way the harmonics are transformed by the sound transferring from the air to the ice to the water to the hydrophone is really amazing. And hearing these things and other aspects that can really represent what's going on in our environment can really create a different level of engagement for people, because it's not just an abstract musical sound. They can have this foundation of something a little more familiar. And then similar to what Paul just showed, I also often use visual imagery, where for my piece Cascade, we've mentioned before, the score, again, much like Paul's, was actually based entirely on edited images of pictures that I took as I hiked around the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument to create the images that were the performers then based their performance off of. And so there's lots of tools in our library that we can use. And I find that most audiences are actually quite fascinated to see that. And even sometimes if it's like the score is not publicly shown to the audience, they're usually like, it was beautiful to look at that mountain with the musical staff superimposed over it. And so it's really engaging in a way, and to project that's great. It creates a new layer of engagement, a new layer of documentation for the audience.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah, Sean, can you wrap us up on that?
Yeah, I really look towards what is sort of the future value of documentation. So most of our politics are really based around ideas of control and certainty, right? How can we control what's happening in our world, right? And how can we feel more certain about it? And what I'm sort of interested in is how documenting this moment in time, creating memory around this moment in time, can actually serve as a form of control and a form of certainty for co-creators at whatever various different level they're at, whether that means they're an audience member, whether or not that means they're participating in the creation of this object. Because I think that really will be one of the major issues that we're going to be facing as a society, right? Over the next 30 years of unremitting climate disaster, we're going to be looking for forms of control and certainty that can help us feel better, right? Help us take control of the world. And there's some really unhealthy things that we might end up doing as a result of that. But I think memory, right, and community, right, can really be a solution to that control and certainty problem. And that's why I think the arts and fine arts are really important, because they can provide other forms of sort of control and certainty that are a little bit more healthy than the ones that will pop up in the form of authoritarianism and conspiracy theories.
Yeah, absolutely. The arts are where cultures embed their memory, and it's hugely important. Okay, so there's some questions in the Q&A to combine them together. So I think we should have time very quickly. First one is, I think there's a strong need for professional productions, but also an enormous power in community engagement in and with the arts. I think you've all touched a bit on that, but how do we engage community members in creating and sharing art related to climate and other global changes? Does anybody want to jump in on that? Maybe Colin, you want to go?
Sure, I have something to say about that, because so this is something that the outreach side of Ocean Networks Canada is really concerned with, and so I've been talking with them about this as well. So they have a newish track of thought that they call art science, which is a way for them to engage with audiences through scientific research through art, right? And that's how my residency is involved with that. But for example, one of the things they're really trying to do is sort of low level ways of engaging their members in a participatory fashion. So I've been participating in a project there of a type of exquisite corpse project, which is where someone creates a snippet of art somehow in just about our method of doing it's any medium. Then you pass that on to someone else. So everyone does one thing, they pass it on to someone else, and they use what was passed to them from the first round as the inspiration for the next round, and so on. We're doing 3 rounds. And out of everyone in the group, I'm the only professional artist. All the rest are ocean scientists or just enthusiastic members of the ONC community. But this is something that is designed to engage people and requires no professional development in art, no degrees, you don't need a PhD. It's like, it's meant for you to express what you're thinking and feeling, and it's not, it's a non-judgmental way, and it's a really great way for people to participate and create, and then we get together and we discuss everything that we're doing, and so it's both participatory and engaging.
Wow, that sounds cool. Yeah, thank you. Okay, Paul, stand up, go ahead.
Yeah, and maybe this isn't super obvious in the clips that I've shown, but just thinking back to Requiem, like the first audience for the work is really the performers, and so these works, and there was over 100 people involved in staging Requiem and performing it, and this group kind of self-organized into this, instant community that came together around a single purpose. And so quite often, people will assemble around work. It's not necessarily the audience. There are audience, I could say like an audience community, but there's also the community of creators, the people that are performing the work and taking on that kind of, particularly in that piece, more of an activist role in the performance. And so, I think it's interesting to, when I'm composing, I'm thinking about who's going to be playing this and why are they playing it, and what's that group going to look like, and how is that group going to culturally manifest themselves as a group to perform. And so, it's a consideration, definitely, in doing that. And, hopefully that sense of community, those people coming together around a singular thing, hopefully I do think that I think it does reflect back to the audience as well. They can see people coming together and cooperating in a certain way to accomplish something.
Okay, yeah, Sean, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, with the process that the Climate Disaster Project follows, once we've worked with a climate disaster survivor to share their story, we also invite the climate disaster survivor to share that process with someone else, to actually help another survivor share their story. And what we find is that this process is contagious, that once people go through this process, once people want to have shared their own experience fulsomely, they want to help other people do that same thing. And we're seeing that all across the country right now as the work of the Climate Disaster Project ramps up.
Okay, thank you. There were two other questions here that actually combined together, so I'd like us to get them. This might take us 2 minutes over, but I think this is important. So it was thinking about, can you talk more about grief, fear, paralysis, and doomism, how people can work through those blockers, and do you ever experience that anxiety yourself, and how does that affect your creative mind or the drive to create and your motivation for it? Yeah, go say, okay, Sean, you wanted to start then?
Yeah. I think a lot of our anxiety related to climate change revolves around the necessity for action versus the chance of action, and that gap between those two things, right? In other words, we desperately need to take action, but the chances of us taking action are very low, or at least they appear to be at the present moment in time. I think for my own part, I think a way forward is, let's just accept the fact that we are in for 30 years of unremitting climate change. And that's what the scientists tell us, regardless of what we do right now. So let's deal with that fact, right? Let's not live in the future tense. Let's live in the present tense, right? Let's deal with what is happening in the now, right? And in the now, right, there are climate disasters happening all over the world, right? We can build community around that experience, and we can find hope around that experience. And through that hope and through that community, then maybe we can take action on this particular issue. But I think it's sort of to let go of this sort of gap, right, between action versus chance of action, and instead focus on what we know and accept the fact that we are going to be living through some pretty terrible times over the next 30 years.
Yeah. Colin, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I was thinking about that, where the way I was framing it in my mind was that, so I recently put on my PhD recital in March, and as my my research focused on the steel pan, it's this really bright, happy instrument from the Caribbean that everyone associates with, very fun, festive music. And a lot of the music that I was performing on it really subverts that image. And so one of them turns it into the most grungy, distorted, heavy sounds you could imagine. And in literally the sound effect that I designed for that, I called Doom Pan. So it kind of fits with the question. And so there's this interesting juxtaposition between the source of the sound, which is bright and happy, and the resultant sound after my processing, which is dark, heavy, loud, and very aggressive. And, I really think that by experiencing these things in a safe environment in the context of a concert, where there's other audience members, but you're there, you're listening, you're safe, there's nothing that's going to happen. It helps you to process it and come to terms with it and be able to address it without concern or fear. And then it's also hopefully in a communal environment where you can engage with it by discussing with other people and process it that way. So that's my take on what I remember of the question.
Sure. Okay, Paul, could you finish us off quickly, please?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I am. Do I have climate anxiety? Yes, I think it's a permanent neuroses for me now. I've been living with it for 20 years, ever since I discovered how bad things could get. And I'm not, like Sean saying, I'm not seeing any sense that we've turned the car around, or even anyone's even at the wheel trying to avoid hitting the brick wall that's ahead. But I think, what's important, again, is going back to this idea of what do you want to do during this period? How do you want to live? What do you, when you look back at your life, how did you live it? What did you, and right now I'm really into learning more about the environment, how it's functioning, what is a forest, what happens in a forest, what is the role of a forest, what information is in the forest, how can that information enrich our culture before those things are gone. I think there's this idea of documenting what is there, having it inform the culture, and hopefully that can be reinvested somehow. That information can be reinvested into a future culture where we have better balance with the environment. And I just want to close by saying, Indigenous cultures lived on this land for thousands of years, for at least 10,000 years in this area, and they did not live in an unsustainable way. They lived in a regenerative way. And when we're talking about sustainability, I think that's a bare minimum of what we should be doing. We should be looking at how can we be regenerative on the land and create a culture that benefits the environment, which in turn benefits us. It's not like we do things for the environment. We should be doing these things because they benefit us, because a healthy environment or a regenerative environment is going to be full of abundance for humans and all living things. So that's what I'm focused on. Yeah.
You all be hopeful. Okay, so I'm just watching the time and we need to finish up yet. I just want to say thank you to Alana from all of us for launching this seminar series and creating a space in which we can have these important conversations. So Alana, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Dineen, and thanks to all the panelists for this important conversation. If you're wondering what you can do, please join us in the Faculty of Fine Arts. This summer, we're starting our very first summer art series in partnership with the Division of Continuing Studies and Alumni Relations. And we're offering a 4-day workshop called Environmental Writing, Turning Knowledge into Feeling, which will be held from July 4th until July 7th and will be led by Arno Kopecky, who is an alum from the Faculty of Fine Arts, the Department of Writing, and a Governor General Award nominee for his work related to the environment. So I encourage you, I think we're going to pop there we have the link to this workshop where you can register. Please join us, as the panelists said. Action and creating work is an important step forward for all of us. So thank you once again to all of the panelists and to you, Dineen, to John Threffel behind the scenes, and to all of you, our audience, for joining us today. Thank you very much.